Well, as you know, I enjoy every time we get a chance to spend time together, especially for this cause. And this is the kind of thing that I've said this 100 times, and I mean it every single time. It is so important to support those who are doing what I can't do. You know, women who have the determination to serve our country deserve our support. So I'm more than happy to be here and join you. And I'm glad to see that you are here and the companies who are represented here are doing just that today. Now, over the years, the role that women play in the armed forces has evolved greatly, as I'm sure you're all aware. We've experienced the dramatic rise in the number of women serving, and we've witnessed a decided change in the shape and the scope of the roles that they played during their service. It's not uncommon for women today to serve in capacities that were once held exclusively for their male counterparts. But now, with the expanded number of service opportunities available to our servicewomen comes a charge, a duty to increase the amount of support available to them as they dedicate their lives to the service of our country. The U.S. Army Women's Foundation is committed to doing just that, supporting women's expanding role in the Army and providing for their professional development in a constantly evolving military environment. Today, we are going to be honoring Vietnam-era servicewomen, nurses who answered the call of their country and flag and who served with honor and determination in a complex and turbulent time. But before we begin, would you please rise for the presentation of the colors by the District of Columbia Army National Guard Selected Honor Guard, and also the singing of our national anthem by Sergeant First Class Leanne Hinton of the U.S. Army Band, Pershing's Own.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
You may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the stage the President of the U.S. Army Women's Foundation, retired Major General Deanne McWilliams.
Well, welcome everyone who wasn't here with us this morning. If you weren't at the symposium with the panels this morning, you really missed a lot. We had some great questions, great presentations, and a lot of networking. So today, the main reason we have this luncheon is to get you all together, but to honor some people. That comes at the end of the luncheon. We have our Hall of Fame awardees, and we have scholarships announced. But I want you to think about those folks while you eat. We exist to, the Army Women's Foundation exists to keep the legacy alive of the women who have served their country, whether they served it 60 years ago or last week. And if you served, you will always be a veteran. So think about those folks. Today we have with us a very interesting soldier. I'd heard about her, but I just met her today. Major General Lynn Cob. She's another example of serving your country. She enlisted in the Army in '74, and in '78 she was commissioned through the University of Alabama ROTC program. Roll Tide. Yes. That's like the guy I heard made a speech once, and he was reading it and not thinking, and he said, "So join me in saying hoo-ah." So roll tide. But she was a distinguished military graduate in a tough ROTC program, because I used to deal with those folks from time to time. Then she got a law degree, went to the appropriate military schools, but stayed in the reserve. She commanded at every level, from platoon leader to the Reserve Deployment Support Command. And now, because she served across the globe, been a role model, done all the hard jobs, and oh, by the way, did that while she had a real job, as we would say in the Army, a civilian job. Her reward is the Pentagon. So she's now serving as Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics. We're very pleased to have General Cobb with us.
For those of you in the room under the age of 25, and there aren't many of you, the West Point cadets, these are called reading glasses. Just wait. Leon Harris, I'm starstruck. You can tell by my accent I'm from LA, Lower Alabama. So I'm trying to read your remarks, but I think I'll stick with mine here. Thank you, Major General McWilliams, Leon Harris, corporate and media sponsors, board members of the Army Women's Foundation, veterans. I'm honored to be your guest today. Your outstanding panel sessions this morning, your legacy scholarships to be awarded later today, are proof of your commitment to Army women and our future. By the way, General McWilliams, I have a check for you here in support of the Army Women's Foundation. I used to raise money for a living for the Boys and Girls Club, and I know how tough it is to keep worthy programs funded. And at this time, I'll ask you to do what I certainly would be doing by now. Your courtesy is appreciated. Please eat. I'll talk louder. Eat. Today we honor Vietnam women veterans. I trace my own time in uniform from the end of that period, and it all started with $56 a month and a boy. That didn't sound real good, did it? I can hear my mother. She's rolling over in her grave. Here's the background. My dad was a career Coast Guard NCO. He'd served in the Navy in World War II. His two uncles in World War I. So I understood the military life and tradition. But time for college came, no real money for that in my family, and the Army Reserve was recruiting young women of high school age to serve as clerk typists. Assisting this effort was my high school government teacher, a lady named Day Fulbright. Some of you, General Pat Foote, and many of you here knew her as Colonel Day Fulbright, a World War II WAC officer, later married an Air Force officer. She was the first woman to be promoted to full colonel in the Army Reserve, and she was my high school government teacher. She was a friend and contemporary of the legends of our early Army years, Brigadier General Elizabeth Hoisington, Brigadier General Mary Clark, the 7th and 9th directors of the Women's Army Corps, and friends with many of you here. One of my fondest possessions is a photo taken with General Clark, me as Private Cob, in that starched cord uniform, white gloves. It was graduation after all. I like the gloves. But I digress, back to the boy and the $56. I think when we enlisted in the Army Reserve in that year, it was about $56 a month. All those forces joined together to inspire 4 girls in my high school class, my boyfriend at the time, and I to enlist in the Army Reserve in May of 1974. The 4 of us enlisted. My boyfriend, he backed out. I was commanding an active duty transportation brigade in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, a few years ago on deployment. And he emailed me. I had been home, seen his parents, and he said, "Janet, can't believe you're still in the Army." I said, emailed him back and said, "Yes, USOB, it's because of you. I'm still in the Army." And today, Donnie Kaler is the executive director of the Georgia Peanut Commission, and I am not married to him. But he is a fine man. I'll share this thought with you. As an Army, we've been intensely occupied for a decade. One of my heroes, General Cody, was involved at every level of that fight. And even in retirement, he continues to support our fight. And because we've been so busy, the subject of women in the military service, it really is not discussed that much. It is evident. General officers, retired senior field grade officers sit among you today. They're visiting with you today as your guests. And when I walk the halls of the Pentagon as a mobilized Army Reserve officer, here's what I see. They're just walking down the hall, doing their job. An African-American woman wearing an Air Force flight suit with a flight jacket, senior pilot wings. A female Marine gunnery sergeant, a gunny, and I straighten up a little bit when I walk by the gunny. A female Marine aviator. Female soldiers wearing jump wings, combat action badges, air assault badges, pilot wings, Purple Hearts. And on the sleeve of their Army service uniforms, a stack of overseas service bars. And on some of the young DC National Guards women a while ago, I saw a few overseas service bars on their uniform as well. At the close of January, Army women deployed since the start of hostilities totaled 138,703, just over 84,000 for the active component, almost 29,000 for the Army National Guard, and almost 26,000 for the Army Reserve. But in my opinion, deployment, warfighting, it has become a matter of course, because today we are just doing our job. The women of World War II, Korea, and you who served in Vietnam are honorees today because you did your job. You put those paved stones down for us, the ones on which we walk today, without real thought of history or breaking glass ceilings. We mean no disrespect by that, but because you did your job, we can just do ours. We put on the helmet, we fly or crew the helicopter, we load the 9mm, we stick the M4 out of the window of the vehicle. We drive the gun truck, we remove the battle-damaged tissue, we direct the intra-theater airlift. We are just doing our job. But that work, the warfight and the support of it, is still today, as it has been, only borne by a very small portion of our national population. But you Vietnam veterans know about that, don't you? We're now in the 50th anniversary time frame for Vietnam service. Military-wide, about 7,500 women served. 6,200, or 83.5%, were nurses. Less than 1,000 a year served at the height of the Vietnam War, a very small population. And that's the first of a few comparisons I'll make today between that generation of service and the service of the generation today. Still, small number of women, all volunteers serving our country. The second commonality is the integration of previously untapped capabilities in 2 different forms. African American women trained as WAC officers and enlisted women, serving in both World War II and Korea, came forward once again to volunteer during the buildup to the Vietnam War. In 1965, Army nurse Major Monica Crossdale Palmer served at the 85th EVAC Hospital in Quin Hao. Please excuse my pronunciations. I don't do math and I don't do languages very well. But if you were there, you know where that was. You knew where the 85th EVAC was. She extended her tour, redeployed to come back to work at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, volunteered to go back to Vietnam, where she served as the operating room supervisor, 7 miles from the Cambodian border. Army nurse First Lieutenant Diane Lindsay awarded the Soldier's Medal of Heroism while assigned to the 95th EVAC Hospital. She talked an unstable soldier under her care into handing over a grenade after he had pulled the pin. African American female chief warrant officers and military intelligence served, supply sergeants, NCOICs, and admin units, and Army women of all ethnic backgrounds. By just doing your job, prompted President Lyndon Johnson to sign Public Law 190 or 9130 in 1967, lifting promotion limitations for women. At that time, only one woman could hold the rank of Brigadier General in any service. It permitted the appointment of WACs to the Army and the Air National Guard. And as with my friend Colonel Day Fulbright, women had been part of the WAC Organized Reserve Corps since 1949. The duty performance of you who served in Vietnam laid the pavestones for the 70s when I came in. At that time, the nation's leaders ended the draft and instituted the all-volunteer Army, a clear acknowledgement that such a radical force change would require women to be a pavestone, a building block of that new force. The 1970s saw women admitted to ROTC programs, and as you see among us today, because they're just doing their job and they don't think it's a big deal, but we know it's a big deal and we're so proud of you, the admittance of women to the United States Military Academy. Some of our cadets are here with us today. And they were, in the 70s, also admitted to the other service academies. The second commonality between the generation of service was the integration of untapped capabilities. The second part of that was not that all ethnic groups were serving, but that many of our Army Reserve and National Guard women were fully integrated into the force. And today, as with me in the Pentagon, General Cody tells me when I've been there 6 years, I can complain. Many of our active deployed formations, our joint and Army staffs at the Pentagon, and our Army commands around the country are staffed by Army Reserve and National Guard general officers, field grade and company grade officers, and non-commissioned officers. And women are in combat. Ask Tammy Duckworth, Lieutenant Colonel, Illinois Army National Guard, Black Hawk pilot, deployed in 2004 for Operation Iraqi Freedom, one of the first women to fly combat operations. And then that year, an RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, hit her helicopter. Her loss, both legs, and partial use of her right arm. Because of the therapy that she went through and the men and women that she struggled beside, she became a tireless campaigner for her fellow wounded warriors. She later became director of the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs and later served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Veteran Affairs. Currently, I understand she's a candidate for the House of Representatives. She declined a military retirement. Why? Because, as we used to say, she drills every month, or as we now say in the Guard Reserve, attends battle assembly as a lieutenant colonel with the Illinois Army National Guard. I don't think it's any big deal to Lieutenant Colonel Duckworth, because women of the Army Reserve and the National Guard have just done their job. The nation will never again go to war without the reserve components. All wars end. During the last 10 years of persistent combat, women have had their war come to an end. Women on active duty rotate to new units, or they ETS. Guard and reserve women, their war ends. They demobilize quickly. Their DD-214 tells them so. They all pack duffel bags and those black plastic footlockers, and they return. But where? To what circumstance of life? This is the third common thread we share between our generations of service, Vietnam and before and today, and to me the most important, the sudden loss of camaraderie. Women today have lived a much different life than women did in the 1960s. A woman served in Vietnam, and when her war ended, She was suddenly plunged back into a society in turmoil from multiple social movements and into a norm of the women's roles expected of that decade. You ladies that served in Vietnam, you flew into hot LZs and fire bases, and because you just did your job every day, you probably developed some pretty fair and advanced surgical techniques if you were a nurse, but when you got back here, doctors didn't want you touching their patients. Maybe you had real decision-making authority in quartermaster or administrative units. It was required of you. You were there. It was handed to you, expected of you. It was up to you. And then your war ended suddenly. It happened for the guys too. A coworker of mine at the Boys and Girls Clubs of South Alabama several years ago had served as a Marine infantryman. He was up on an LP, a listening post in the Central Highlands on a Friday, and the word came up as it did. Good news travels fast. His ticket had been punched, the Freedom Bird was awaiting, and he was on his way home, and that was Friday. He came off the hill. Friday, on Monday morning, he was sitting on the edge of his bed in Mobile, Alabama, staring at the wall, and his father walked in, looked at him and said, "You need to get a job," and walked out. It happened to you too. You were in Pleiku or Tehran or Chulai, and then you were back in the land of the big PX. You had lived a life no one around you could comprehend. And now it dropped back into that most traditional of worlds. Who could you talk to about the importance of dry socks and the taste of a cold beer? You who never liked the taste of beer after that steamy jungle rain. About the clink of lead tossed into metal trays in an operating room. About the laughter from the girls in your tent as you tried to do your hair. You were back. Did your old boyfriend understand? Did he understand that some of the men in Vietnam were your brothers? And that men and women can have a real camaraderie born of shared sacrifice and risk? Do you remember the looks you received when the men and women who were older than you asked what it was like for a woman over there? And look behind me. Look at these wonderful photographs. What about those girls? Where are they now? The girl from Iowa, West Virginia, California. The nurse from Hawaii whose war was over still ran outside when she heard the helo pass overhead, standing on the front steps in Hawaii waiting for the casualties to come in till she remembered where she was. That is no apocryphal story. Do you know her? Did you know her? You understand her if you're a Vietnam veteran, because you are her in some sense. You were her at some moment in time back home based on the noise you heard in the night, the backfire of a vehicle, or the firecracker. When you heard that story about that nurse, you got it. You just did your job every day. Your war ended, you came back, you would not, you could not discuss what you'd lived through with anyone who wasn't there, who didn't get it. The loss of camaraderie, I know and I understand. After the start of combat operations in March 2003, my reserve unit, which had been at the port of Ashueba since November of 2002, we discharged 105 ships and 90,152 pieces of equipment. We came back, demobilized at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and went to the Four Winds after our year. And as anxious as I was, and all of my soldiers were for that freedom, I missed my soldiers. I was anxious. Being separated from them really affected me. And even in that leadership position, when you must stay separated from your soldiers to a certain degree, we had filled sandbags together to reinforce bunkers. And we dove into those bunkers together the night the war started, when the incoming sirens screamed, in full MOP 4, sweating and claustrophobic. We did that job. We sent our warfighters, General Cody and so many others, up into Iraq. I was glad to return to civilian employment, great family, great coworkers, supportive friends, but they had not been where I'd been. They had not experienced what I had. They didn't get it, and it's not their fault. How could they? The loss of camaraderie. Life goes on eventually, of course. We are creatures capable of healing spiritually, physically, and mentally. Life goes on, and we eventually adapt and adjust, most of us. And most of us have adjusted, and that's the fourth commonality between our generations of service. those who could not adjust, those who dropped out, overcome by PTSD, and all these years later, some of you now have a name to go with those feelings that you had all those years after the war. Those who were self-medicating with alcohol and illegal drugs and who developed full-blown mental illness. Add a category of citizens not seen since the Depression of the 1930s, the homeless. The National Coalition for Homeless Veterans puts today's total at around 67,000. Roughly 5% of that is the female population, and they claim that nearly one-half are Vietnam veterans to this day. There are many societal causes to homelessness, but these are our brothers and our sisters. Do not forget them. And finally, the loss, our final commonality. 8 women killed in Vietnam, 7 were Army nurses. 2 killed in a helicopter crash, 2 in a plane crash. 1 died from a stroke, 1 from serious illness. 1, First Lieutenant Sharon Lane, the most famous, killed in action from shrapnel at the 312th evac in July and June of 1969. The 8th woman was an Air Force nurse, Captain Therese Klinker, killed in an operation that I remember as a young woman that I'd not thought about in more than 30 years when I was doing the research. Killed in the crash of a C-5 Galaxy in April 1975 outside Saigon while evacuating Vietnamese orphans during Operation Baby Lift. 36 women working for various U.S. government agencies were part of that mercy flight and perished on that day, as did a teacher and a child. Our loss in Afghanistan, female casualties, 14 to hostile fire, 8 to non-hostile fire, 192 wounded in action. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, female deaths, 50 to hostile causes, 39 non-hostile, 546 wounded in action. In Operation New Dawn, the post-combat operations in Iraq, 11 wounded in action. Women civilians died in Vietnam. They worked for the Red Cross, Army Special Services, Catholic Relief Services, the CIA, USAID, the Department of the Navy, 2 journalists and 6 missionaries. And by the way, the only female POW and the only female MIA were both missionaries. One disappeared in 1962 and is considered the only POW, although she did not hold military rank. Another was captured in a raid on the same leprosarium as the earlier doctor was, same place, still missing, the only 2 to this day. And I didn't know this, but lost coordinates are listed for POWs, marking their last known location. To the women veterans of Vietnam, your lost coordinates are 1959 at one end of the wall to 1975 at the other. The years that frame the official start and conclusion of the Vietnam War, the years that bracket your youth, the span of time that reflect not just loss of youth, loss of innocence, but represent the years that were the pavestones that you put down for those of us who have followed your path. The women veterans of Vietnam, whether officer, enlisted, or warrant officer, a one-term enlistee, or a career soldier, served and persevered during one of the most tumultuous times in our nation's history. Your individual story of military service, whether told in the old tradition or held close to your heart, is our story today, and we pass it to these young women that are coming behind us. We share the military service, the Women in Military Service Memorial at Arlington with you. We walk over to the Vietnam Women's Memorial near the wall. Their life is affirmed in the yellowwood trees, the viburnum, the shadblow, and the cotton castor growing around the monument. We are the living, and we look to life as validation of all we've done, and we look to life for the future: marriage, divorce, children, career, citizenship, the joy and loss. And we look to you because you came home and in the many years since have just done your job and lived your life. As we close, remember the women that died in Vietnam and their brothers as well. Let us recall the words of the poet Benyon, who said, "Age, they shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." Women veterans of the Vietnam War, our honored guests today, please stand and be recognized by this gathering. I knew that colonel in that wheelchair would stand up. I knew she would. I'm closer to your generation than the generation I serve with today and that I help lead. I did not know you, and yet you were my role models, my mentors, and after today, my sisters. I salute you.